Today, I'm going to share with you 3 hacks to help you run deep in poker tournaments more often. Have you ever wondered how some pros seem to always be there towards the end of the poker tournament? Well, it's mostly because they do not make silly mistakes and stack themselves early on in the tournament, which gives them many, many more opportunities to run deep later. And in this video, you're going to learn 3 ways they do that. First, they stop getting stacked when they get coolered. Also, they give up on bluffs when it makes sense. And also, they get full value when they are in a situation where they are very likely to be good, even with a non-premium hand. So let's get right to it. Hack number 1 is to stop getting stacked when you get coolered. Now, obviously, everyone is going to run into these, call them setup situations, as much as everyone else on average. But the players who run deep over and over again simply don't get stacked in these spots. And sometimes you're going to find that you have to be willing to make huge folds. It's very important to realize that hand values are relative to what's on the board, right? Sometimes 3 of a kind is really good. Sometimes it's not good at all. And you have to be willing to make folds when it makes sense. Also, some players, when they want to put in all their money early on in a tournament, they have the nuts almost every time. And if you're sitting there with the second nuts, and you know they have the nuts, well, you have to be willing to fold. How many times have you been playing and you thought to yourself, man, I know they have it, but I'm going to call anyway. My hand's too good. Well, that may be a big mistake. You have to get rid of your ego, and you have to trust yourself and trust your reads, assuming your reads are good and you're a good poker player, and be willing to make the folds that are demanded from the game. Let's take a look at 2 examples. Here's one example where someone made a big blunder. Here we have a raise playing 100 big blinds deep from the hijack. We defend pocket 7s in the big blind. So far, so good. 10, 8, 4. Opponent. We check from the big blind. Hijack continuation bets. We call on 10, 8, 4 or pocket 7s. That is fine and reasonable. Turn is a 7. We got there. We check. Opponent checks it back. River is the king, putting up a backdoor flush. There are 3 hearts on the board now. We decide to check the river. You may say, why check the river? Shouldn't you bet? Well, this is a spot where if your opponent has a king, they're very likely to value bet. And if they have nothing, they will at least consider bluffing on this river card that should connect with a lot of their flop bluffs that decided to give up on the turn, like king, queen, king, jack, king, 9, etc. So this is a great spot to check, looking to put in the check raise. We check. Opponent does bet 3,000 into 5,400. Raising at this point is mandatory. You may think, but they could have a flush or a straight. They could, but more often than not, they don't. If you put in the raise in the spot, if they have 2 pair, they're probably going to call. They might even call with a king, so put in the raise. We make it 12,000. We bump it up pretty big. The opponent then rips it all in for 37,000 total. Now at this point, a lot of people think, they probably have the flush, but I have a set. I got to call. But no, you do not have to call. In this scenario, this hand was played perfectly fine up until the river. But once you check raise and then get jammed on, your opponent's going to show you a flush almost every single time in this scenario. And this time, this player called, and they were shown the nut flush. Who'd have thought? Let's take a look at another spot where this player played it much better. Here we have pocket kings raising it up, 100 big blinds deep in the cutoff. Small blind and big blind call. Flop comes king 10-4, 2 clubs. We flop the nuts, top set. Check, check. We go for a small continuation bet, 300 into 980 chips. And I could be convinced that slightly bigger is better, given the board has 2 Broadway cards that are suited, but whatever, 300 is fine. Both players call. Turns it to a spades. Total brick. Check, check. This is a great spot to bet, again, using a bigger size, because the board is very dynamic. We have the best hand almost always at the moment, but it is vulnerable to being outdrawn. We go 1,500 into the 1,880 pot. Small blind and big blind call. River's the 7 of clubs, completing the flush. Small blind. Puts their whole stack in. 7,900. Big blind folds. What do we do with our 3 kings in this scenario? Well, the answer is easily put your cards in the muck, which we do this time. This is a situation where when your opponent leads all in, they really have to have a very good hand, because if you consider both the big blinds range and the cutoffs range to bet the flop and call the flop and bet the turn or call the turn, they have all the flushes in their range. right? Like the cutoff's going to raise with all sorts of suited cards with clubs. They're going to bet the flop with them. They could conceivably bet the turn with them, and they could just be sitting here with a flush, which would not fold. The big blind would also call a flop bet with a flush draw, call a turn bet with a flush draw, and have flushes a lot on the river. So this would be a spot where bluffing would be torching money for the most part because you're betting into two ranges, both of which that contain a ton of nut hands. So in this spot, small blind's probably just not bluffing. Now, if the small blind is a loose, crazy, insane maniac, maybe you can find a call. But in almost all scenarios, when people overbet compared to the pot, notice here it's about 8,000 into 6,000 or so. That's usually a sign of strength. When they lead, when the obviously scary card comes, that's usually a sign of strength. When they're betting into two people, both of which have the nuts some portion of the time, that's a huge sign of strength. You got to fold. So, two spots where we got set up. In one of them, the player played it poorly and got stacked. In the other one, the player lost not even that many chips. What did they start with? They started with 10,000, and in this pot, they ended up losing a whopping 2,000 chips. 20 big blinds with top sets. That's how you start running deep. Hack number 2 is to give up on bluffs more often. A lot of players feel like if they bet the flop and they bet the turn, they have to bluff it on the river. But that is a big mistake because a lot of players think to themselves, well, if I call a turn bet, I have to call a river bet. And you're going to find that in general, the number one spot to give up on a bluff is when you expect your opponent to overfold the turn. Meaning, you're going to make them fold out all their marginal stuff with a chunky turn bet. And because of that, when they call your turn bet, their range is condensed. It's strong. Stronger than perhaps it would be in GTO world, right? And when that is the case, when their range should be much stronger than normal going to the river, you usually don't want to bluff the river, especially when the board does not change substantially. Like if a flush card comes or a straight card comes, bluffing is probably okay. But if the board really does not change to the point that if they had something like top pair, it's still really, really good, don't bluff. Let's take a look at an example of this. Here we have ace, 2 of spades. We are playing 60 big blinds deep, hijack raises, we call the big blind. Flop comes, jack, 4, 3, 1 spade, we check. Opponent bets 7,000 into 27,000. This is a fine spot to raise or call. We make it 27K. Opponent calls. Turn is a 7 of spades, putting up our flush draw. This is a great spot to keep betting. Pot's 81,000. We go 60. Now, when we go 60,000 here, and the opponent calls, if the river does not complete some straights or the flush, we don't really need to be bluffing. Why? Because most people, when they call this turn bet, will have a jack or better. And if they have a jack or better, and the river is a brick, to the point that it doesn't really make the board scarier, your opponent's probably not going to be folding all that often. So we bet 60K, opponent calls. River is a terrible card to keep bluffing on. The 3 of hearts. You may say, why is it terrible? We could have a 3. Well, we don't have all that many 3s. We're not going to check raise a lot of 3s, and we're not going to bet them on the turn all that often. So in this scenario, we don't have a whole lot of premium hands, really just straights with the 6-5 and sets / 2 pairs / boats, right? So this is a spot where if the opponent has a jack, they're literally never folding. So for that reason, check and give up. It's also very good to check and give up with busted flush draws and often backdoor flush draws, because when you have the busted flush draw, it's less likely your opponent has a busted flush draw, right? Because you block some of those hands. Your opponent can't be sitting here with a random king 2 of spades that decided to raise, right? Also, when you have the ace high draw, you actually beat some of your opponent's hands that may check it back on the river. Like say your opponent does have king 10 of spades. Maybe they decide to call the flop check raise for fun. Maybe they have king queen of spades. That would make more sense. Then they call the turn bet, and then they're on the river and they think, okay, well, I'm just going to check it back. And then you sometimes win with the ace high. So if there's ever a bluff to give up with in this scenario, this is it. We check. Opponent rips it in. Easy fold. We have nothing. Move on with your life. Hack number 3 is to value bet relentlessly. Most recreational players will tell you very clearly early in pots what they have with their actions. Whenever they have a good hand, they either bet big or they raise. I know that sounds overly simplistic, but that's what they do. When they have a hand they think is very good, they want to put money in the pot. So if you know your opponent did not raise or they're not blasting it, they probably don't have a very strong hand. And this will let you deviate from game theory optimal strategies heavily on turns and rivers, which will allow you to go for thinner value over and over and over again in spots where in game theory optimal world, you may have to check it back. And you're gonna find that picking up these extra chips with your value bet can make a good player a great player. So let's take a look at two examples here. We have king 10 of spades. We raise it up in the hijack seat. Big blind calls. Flop comes. King, queen, 2. They check. We continuation bet. 20K into 60. They call. Turns to jack of diamonds. They check. We bet again. 65K. This bet is perfectly reasonable with top pair and a draw. They call. River's a 3 of spades. So we have top pair, marginal kicker. They check. Now, at this point, this hand is close between value betting and checking. But if you think your opponent's going to check raise the flop with 2 pair and better, and you think they're going to check raise the turn with 2 pair and better, well, we pretty much have the nuts, right? Because they don't have ace king preflop. They would re-raise that. They probably don't have random king 3, queen 3, 3-2, right? So even though it's kind of hard to find all that many hands we can get value from, this is still a good spot to bet, because if your opponent does have a king, they're just going to call. I know there's not a whole lot of kings available because there's one on the board and one in our hand, but they could have a king. Also, if they have a queen, like queen 10 or queen 9, they may decide to find a call. Pot's 229K. We go all in. You're going to find that in general, when you have about a pot size bet remaining on the river, you usually only want to use one bet size, which is all in. This is not a spot to bet something like 60K and try to get a little bit of value out of your opponent, because if you bet 60K and your opponent does decide to shove all in, it puts you in a miserable spot, and it's not worth the risk of reopening the action and giving your opponent the chance to bluff you. Now, you may say, if you shove, will your opponent ever call with a weak king or a queen? Some players will. Now, if your opponent won't, imagine you know so much about your opponent to the fact that you know they don't ever have worse than... Imagine you know that your opponent never has a hand better than yours on the river, unless it's like king 3, queen 3, etc. But you also somehow know they never call a river bet all in without 2 pair better. Well, in that scenario, maybe you don't want to shove. But maybe exploitatively a smaller bet does make sense, because that type of player probably doesn't check raise bluff the river ever, right? So always consider the mistakes your opponent's likely to make. But in general, this is a spot where if you do bet, you want to be ripping it in. We do shove. We do get called. And we're out of the tournament. Oh no, we win. We get a full double up instead. King 8 of diamonds. Makes good sense. They could have a lot of kings in this spot. And remember, if your opponent will turn their hand face up by raising with it on the flop or the turn, if they can beat your hand, on this run out, you have the best hand almost always, and there is value to be had. Let's take a look at another example. Here we have 10-9 of spades. Cutoff raises 46 big blinds deep. We call button. Flop comes 10-9-3. All hearts. 2 pairs not so good on an all heart board, but it's okay. They check. We go 12,000 into 36,000, and they call. Turn is a 5 of spades. They check. This is a spot where a lot of people get scared and think, well, they could have a flush. I better check it back. But no. You have the best hand here almost every time. We go for a medium bet, 40,000 into 60,000, and they call. River's a queen of spades. They check. Pot is 140,000. We have 166,000 in our stack, a little bit more than the size of the pot. This is a situation, again, where people think, well, they could have king jack, they could have jack 8, they could have a flush, they could have queen 10, they could have queen 9, they could have all that stuff. Fortunately for you, if they have a flush, a lot of people just bet it on the flop or check raise it on the flop or check raise it on the turn. So you can start to discount a lot of that. Your opponent could have queen 10. That's very possible. They could have queen 9. That's very possible. Notice, though, you block those with your 10 and your 9, so that's quite nice. They could have something like king of hearts, jack. Maybe king with a jack of hearts, so you do lose to those. Jack 8's kind of unlikely because they raise the cutoff. If you think about it, though, they could have a lot of hands like ace 10, king 10, ace queen with a heart, king queen with a heart, queen jack with a heart. All those hands make a whole lot of sense. So this is a spot where we could be beat, but we need to go for value. We rip it all in for a touch more than pot. Opponent calls with ace of hearts, queen, and we get the full double up. And this is a situation where a lot of people bet the flop correctly, bet the turn correctly, check it back on the river, thinking, it's probably close. And to be fair, it's not like this is an automatic slam dunk all in against everybody in all scenarios, but against people who don't have that many flushes in their range because they would have bet them on the flop, or they would have check raised them on the flop, or check raised them on the turn, we have the best hand the vast majority of the time. And picking up an extra 33 big blinds in this scenario is going to go a long way to increasing your win rate and helping you run deep in tournaments far more often. So that's it. The 3 hacks to run deep more in tournaments. Hack number 1 is to stop getting stacked when you get coolered. Hack number 2 is to give up more often with your bluffs, especially when it's a scenario where your opponent's probably going to call with all their made hands. And hack number 3 is to value bet relentlessly. Use these 3 hacks and start running deep more often right now. That's it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. If you have a friend who always complains about getting unlucky and getting coolered, share this video with them. They will be very, very grateful. I'll talk to you next time.